Welcome to the Engagement is in Compliance podcast. My name is David Schmidt Jiménez, and I'm a late diagnosed autistic English language development teacher. I happen to be Cuban American. Um, and I'm here to talk about how I think school failed me and how I think we can do better for kids. And episode one is going to be about um, why do schools confuse obedience with learning? I'm going to be talking about a moment from my classroom experiences as a student. I'm going to be talking about how multilingual learners and autistic students get labeled unmotivated. I'm going to be talking about why poverty makes compliance feel like survival. And I'm going to be talking about the cost of getting this wrong for me and the concerns I have when I think about the children that I serve. Um, so when I think about confusing obedience with learning and um, my childhood, I think the best example is being required to memorize historical facts and dates and stuff in order to be allowed to enter the classroom without ever actually synthesizing that information in ways that were analytical. It was all about just memorizing and regurgitating information. And I remember the reason I'm connecting this with obedience is because we had to do that to get access to the classroom in the morning. And if we couldn't answer enough questions right with this teacher, that teacher would not let us in their room. They would pretty much kind of give us like a temporary like morning detention and line us up for a consequence and just grill us and make us feel bad for not memorizing information. And I'm sure she thought that she was doing us a favor by like teaching us to like get the good habit of like memorizing and studying. But I always knew and understood internally that memorizing that information was pretty useless. And I was good at it. And maybe that's why it was so frustrating for her as a teacher, is that she knew I had the ability to do it and I just chose not to. And then why did I choose not to? What was that about? And it used to be that I was called lazy or arrogant or rude, bad sometimes, just a bad kid, like a disobedient kid. That was a good one too. And absolutely, I was disobedient. But I wasn't disobedient in like a way that was like trying to hurt people. It was always disobedient, like, that doesn't make sense. Why are you making me do that? Why are you asking me to do that? And totally understand that when adults are confronted with children that ask good questions and like question why do you do things the way you do it and why are you making me do things, how that can be really frustrating because it frustrates me sometimes too. Um, at the same time, it's totally valid. And we can learn so much when kids question us and ask us why we do things. If we listen and we reflect and we take them seriously. And so that experience with that teacher, that was so stressful. And I doubt any of us actually retained any of that information. And that's also connected to this way of thinking about education called the banking model of education, which basically dehumanizes people and it treats us like empty vessels that are just receptacles of other people's knowledge that's deposited in our heads. And like, that's never how I've been, right? Like, I'm not an empty vessel, I'm a processing machine. I take in information from all places, from the environment, from books, from everything I can get my hands, anywhere I can get information, and I integrate it and I synthesize it and I make it new and I make it mine. And I think we can all do that. I think that's a human talent. And I was just so stubborn and disobedient and pathologically demand avoidant, or I had a persistent drive for autonomy that was so intense that like you just could not get me to do things that didn't make sense unless, of course, you had hacked my brain using autonomy, belonging, and competence. Right? So These experiences with compliance-based schooling and people trying to force me to do things that didn't make sense to me and then punish me, these obviously had a really big detrimental effect on my motivation and my engagement and my attitude towards school. As a small kid, I remember watching the Magic School Bus and thinking that's school, like it's going to be like Miss Frizzle. And then slowly as I aged, it became less and less like the Magic School Bus. And frankly, more and more kind of like prison. Like, I know it's terrible to say, but it was. School became more and more like prison. It became about compliance and just doing what the authority person tells you or regurgitating information in the way that they interpreted it and not questioning it and not creating your own information, just being expected to regurgitate the information of other people. All right, so that brings me to like my second point. So, how do multilingual learners, both newcomers and what are students we frequently describe as long-term English learners, which no, absolutely not. We should be calling them experienced multilingual people or experienced multilingual learners because they bring wealth of cultural experience and they can help, they understand how to bridge cultures. They are fantastic. They just haven't passed a test that is rather arbitrary. While based on like a good understanding of linguistics and language development, it doesn't necessarily capture what a student's broad abilities are linguistically. It just captures their English proficiency. And that test is called the WIDA. Right, so we have long-term or experienced multilingual learners, and we have newcomers, and then we have the kids in between. And like students that I serve are a spectrum of different people. What they have in common is linguistic differences. Their families speak different languages other than English at home, right? So obviously that means that these are immigrant families. And then the other group of people I wind up serving just because I'm in the classroom with them are like neurodivergent people, and a lot of times there's overlap there, right? And I work middle school, and I've been working middle school my whole teaching career. I worked middle school in Nicaragua, and I've worked middle school in Baltimore. And I could not figure out for the life of me why some teachers could get kids engaged and motivated and to get them to do things that like I couldn't. And I saw it in Nicaragua and I saw it in Baltimore. The same exact idea, right? The same structure, the same like cognitive work, but when it was me trying to get the kids to do it, they wouldn't. And then my counterpart would do the same thing and the kids would just lock in and focus. And what it was all along, I'm coming back to this and I'll never stop coming back to this, it was that those teachers knew how to support students' autonomy, belonging, and competence. They developed good, healthy relationships with these students, and so students wanted to engage with them in learning and wanted to meet their expectations out of sincere, positive connection, not out of compliance, not because you have authority, but because they feel bonded to you and they feel close to you and they trust you. And when we feel those connections with people, we engage and we want to learn with them and from them and meet their expectations. And so what happens by middle school, this is a really telling thing. Like, I love this observation that one middle school learner that I work with, who I think is gifted, talented, but not identified because they moved here late, like in beginning of middle school, and they haven't been assessed, but so astute in their observations. And here's what they always ask me. Walking by the cafeteria in the morning when the preschoolers and kindergartners are having their lunchtime, it's a dance party and it's like boo, 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 and the kids are dancing, pop, 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 and it's lovely and it's fantastic. And then when they have lunch, when middle school has lunch, it's like, be quiet. We need to control everything. You're too much. You're too loud. If you're not this, if you're not that, no recess, blah, blah, blah. It's really intense and like, and it's really hard to be there. And a lot of kids feel stressed out in that space. And I know it's complicated. You have to manage behaviors and bigger bodies and hormones, bigger behaviors. It's complicated. But the point that student made always was like, why don't they give us a chance to celebrate and be happy and have some fun in lunch too. Like, what's that about? And I went, it's your age. As you get older, we treat you differently. We treat people differently as they age. And middle schoolers are really, really kind of get the poo poo from society and culture. Like when you tell people you're a middle school teacher, they're like, oh, wow. Like, and frankly, I don't think it's actually any different. It's just like knowing how to relate to them. And so that student's observation was fantastic, right? And so I guess what I'm getting at is like, why broadly do middle school age kids start to show disengagement? And I think what it is that they can see how unfair the expectations we put on them are, where we both boss them around like they're children, but then we expect them to act like adults. And and they don't get the benefit of either. They don't get the benefit of the joy and the play of being a child in the same way. And they don't get the benefit of the autonomy and the freedom and the sense of competence of adulthood. We kind of take both of those from middle school age kids. But then you throw in language learning, that you're either identified as a ESOL kid or English language development student, or you're identified for special ed services and you have an IEP, or maybe you have a 504 plan. And when sadly, I think when so many teachers see those labels, they don't mean to. I don't think this is intentional, but there's something about society, there's this implicit bias, and there's a tendency to see it with a deficit. You mix in the banking model of education that everyone's an empty vessel that you need to deposit information into with this notion that these labels are deficits, and now it's like everyone's talking about how can I get the information in my brain and deposit it into that broken brain that has these language deficiencies or these learning struggles or deficiencies. And like, that's just not true. And that's where it all starts, right? The very start of the unmotivated behavior from middle schoolers in general starts off with the sense that they like are very aware of the gap in like expectations. So then, like, how do we address that? Again, it's supporting autonomy, belonging, and competence. So while I'm experienced working with multilingual and autistic and like neurodivergent students, and frankly, like all types of students, um, my my view is that everything I say is good for all kids and it's good for all people, because self-determination theory, where that autonomy, belonging, competence thing I keep talking about comes from, it's about humans. It's about human engagement and human well-being and human motivation, and how we create like positive feedback loops that keep us hungry and like consuming the the fruits of reality, of like that make being fascinating and rewarding, right? That's what self-determination theory. It's awakening that by meeting our human needs, that I think in traditional societies and traditional ways of learning and engaging with other people in community, we we were more effective at in some societies at doing that. Like, but that's a whole nother topic. Um, so now, um, why does poverty make compliance feel like survival? So I have to jump to high school me now, because elementary and middle school, like economically, things were okay. In high school, I moved to live with my grandma, and we were poor. Just to keep it simple, we were poor. We lived on Social Security income and like my fast food and my lifeguarding checks. And my dad asked for a lot of money from us while we were like making things, like barely making it. And so I remember in high school, like constantly people trying to get me to comply, and I tried, and I really did try so hard the first quarter of every school year in high school, and I just couldn't keep it together. And and I really do think that part of it was the stress of poverty, um, and like the stress of moving, and then like the, unrecognized stress of like being autistic and probably ADHD too, and having that gifted label at the same time, and just folks having these really unrealistic expectations of how I would behave in class and like what I could do. Um, and so you intersect all those things, and like I remember like attendance, right? Like just being told I had to show up to school even though I wasn't learning or getting anything out of it, because if I didn't, then I wouldn't be able to graduate. Like, so even though there was no actual value in coming to school, I had to show up. And then the more important story here is that like I did horrifically in high school overall. And I did that with like two possible plans. Either I would join an apprenticeship program with either the carpenters union or the electricians union, or maybe plumbers or steam fitters or something, or I would go to community college. And it just so happened that the local electricians union was recruiting, and I applied. And I remember being so anxious about it and like trying to prep and trying to imagine what they might talk to me or ask me about. And I remember being nervous that they had asked for my high school transcript because I knew it was trash and I knew the obscene amount of absences I had and all that. And so it was a panel interview. They just couldn't take their eyes off my attendance and my grades, and said I was kind of a joke and they didn't take me seriously, and like really shouldn't be applying. I didn't even have like construction experience, not to mention I was a bad student. Like they told me to get a job at Best Buy, and they told me I needed to get my act together if I wanted to basically like be an adult. And that was when I went, "Oh, that's what the compliance was about." The compliance was if I didn't comply, there'd be a record of my non-compliance. And now that there's this record, now they're taking opportunities from me because I refused to comply in a system that wasn't meeting my needs, that didn't make sense for me. And I refused to comply out of survival to like protect my brain and stay regulated. I opted out of a lot of things related to school. And it came back and it bit me in the butt in the most brutal way it could have. And I cried a lot for a few days after that. I felt like awful because I knew I could be an electrician. Like I'm good at reading diagrams and the math of that electricians have to do. I would have been fantastic at it. It's sad because I know I would be, and part of me still wishes I wasn't an electrician. And that is like now as a teacher, when I tell kids that compliance, I don't say it like that, but I try to teach them like your survival, unfortunately, in this system depends on your compliance with these rules because there are people keeping a tally of your attendance and your grades, and there are some people that are going to look at it in the long run. And so you, even if this system doesn't always make sense and it's not meeting your needs and how it's done, you still need to be compliant and you need to figure out how to do both. And I got to tell kids that in like a gentle way. Like you need to be compliant and you also need to like work with me and hopefully other teachers too, um, to like support your autonomy, belonging, and competence so that you're not just in compliance mode, and that so that um, you can stay in those positive feedback loops that I was hinting at. And so like I didn't do it and it cost me. Um, had I known what I know now, I would have been more compliant. And I would have done it knowing that that compliance was necessary for survival, to get out of poverty and to not continue experiencing poverty. But instead, I went to community college for 7 years because I had to work full time and overtime many weeks, and take out student loans and have a Pell Grant and juggle all that and try to make it work. And yeah, it took me 7 years to get my undergraduate degree in Latin American Studies and Spanish language. Um, and it didn't have to be that way. But in a compliance based system, people like me that don't comply, either because we choose not to or because we can't, however you want to think about it, it puts us at this huge disadvantage. And like the whole time I was just saying, like, why don't you meet my needs? Like, like why don't you actually help me instead of just making me do what you want me to do, telling me you know it's good for me when you don't know what's good for me. I think a lot of us kids, like when we're kids, we know what we need and what's good for us with guidance and support. Um, so, what was the cost of getting it wrong? That's what I was just hinting at. The cost of getting this wrong is putting kids in the school to prison pipeline. It's putting kids in the school to addiction pipeline. It's putting kids in the school to poverty pipeline. That's the cost of an obedience based school system that doesn't see people as people but empty vessels which we need to deposit knowledge into, and not as human beings that can synthesize information and create instead of just have to remember other people's knowledge. We break people. We break children. And it broke me for a while. And I got so lucky in college. I had some fantastic professors at CCBC and Towson University, and later at UMBC, that helped put me back together. And it could only happen in that context because as an adult, I finally had what I always needed, what we all need: autonomy, belonging, and competence. And I had the beautiful, great fortune of a lovely family who I just happened to encounter in life, helping me out by basically subsidizing my housing and creating employment opportunities for me. So it was chance. It was that I had the right professors at the right time when I was struggling, and that I had a support system in that family I'm talking about and giving me housing and employment. And that's why I didn't become a drug addict. And that's why I didn't wind up in prison. My father was a drug addict. My father served time in prison. And I almost became him. And now I can't help but wonder if he wasn't just another kid like me. And I don't talk to that guy anymore because he has his own problems. But it breaks my heart to think that maybe my father couldn't meet my needs because his needs weren't met, because the system was about compliance and it wasn't about cultivating what we already have. It wasn't about helping us create. It was about shaping us into people that we were never meant to be. So that's why I'm not going to stop saying that engagement isn't compliance. Engagement isn't compliance. Engagement is connection. Engagement is community. Engagement is love. It's not force. It's not control. It's not the dark side. Engagement is natural. We want to do it until people force us. Hey, this is David Schmidt Jiménez. Thanks so much for listening to episode 1. of my podcast. As I'm editing, I realized that I didn't answer the initial core question, which was why do schools confuse obedience with learning? And after having some time to process and talk to other people, um, I think the answer to that question is that um, one, it's easier. It's easier to demand that people obey rather than it is to try to like meet their actual needs. Because everyone's needs are different, and that requires a lot of effort and thought, and it requires a lot of relationship building, which takes energy. I think the other reason is because when you apply self determination theory, the way that I understand it and think about it, and all the practices that are in actual technical instructional practices, ultimately, I'm always asking of myself, and therefore of other teachers are going to try to do things my way, in a self determination theory informed way of doing things, is that it asks the teacher to take ownership of almost all of the responsibility of what happens in their classroom. Um, I am asking of myself and of other teachers to be very reflective in how they use language and how they plan, um, and make modifications. Really thinking, are they asserting or thwarting autonomy, belonging, or competence? And that's a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. And as an autistic person, that hyper focus and that reflecting on things that interest me over and over again it's delightful. I love it. And so as I reflect on being autistic, um, and also why I think schools confuse obedience with learning, it's not to speak negatively of other teachers whatsoever. It's to recognize that it's hard work, and and of course naturally people are going to look for ways to lighten the load. So why do schools confuse obedience with learning? It's easier to focus on obedience, um, because our jobs are already incredibly hard. So we're trying to lighten the load. Thanks again for listening, and please don't forget to like, subscribe, and or follow on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and connect with me on LinkedIn. Thanks, and I hope you have a joyful time and whatever remains of your day.